We respectfully acknowledge that Dakota County Library and its 9 locations are located on the traditional and ancestral lands of Indigenous people. Dakota County resides on land that was inhabited by the Wapakuti and Midwakatoan Dakota people and other Native nations from time immemorial. Seated in a land treaty signed in July of 1851, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. We also want to respectfully acknowledge that Dakota County Library is the namesake of the Dakota people. By offering this acknowledgement, we work towards our value of acting inclusively and our mission of learning, and recognize our collective responsibility to engage our community in the history of the lands of Indigenous people.
Thank you, everyone, for joining for tonight's program. This will be part of Dakota County Library Asian American and Pacific Islander Experiences, which has been a series of virtual programs hosted throughout the month of May. Our Asian American and Pacific Islander Experiences virtual series has been generously funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, which was voted in by Minnesota voters in 2008. Thank you, everybody, again for joining for tonight's program. We have tonight's our guest author will be Kalia Yang. She'll be reading excerpts from her latest book, Somewhere in the Unknown World, which is an anthology book that documents different experiences refugees have. Kalia Yang is a locally based Minnesota Hmong author who has won numerous awards and who has authored numerous books for all ages. I want to welcome Kalia Yang.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's really a pleasure to end this relatively great day in Minnesota with all of you. I'm coming to you from my office in St. Paul, Minnesota. So this is where I've been writing all year long and where I've been doing many of my talks this year. That little vine that you see in the background was just a baby when this pandemic began. So we've been at this for a while. But I am so very happy tonight to share with you from my newest memoir, Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir. I'm going to read from the book and let the book do its talking, and then I'll open up and we can have a Q&A and engage directly. I always say this, and I mean it. You can ask me what you want. I reserve the right to answer you any way I want. But for those of you who are here, I think it's important that you know, if you don't know, that while Minnesota is not high up for diversity, we have more refugees per capita here than any other state in the nation. So this is obviously something that I'm incredibly proud of and very happy to be part of. And so with that, Somewhere into the Unknown World, dedication. For the refugees from everywhere, men, women, and children whose fates have been held by the interests of nations, whose rights have been contested and denied, whose thirst and hunger go unheeded and unseen. The book begins with a poem by the great American poet Lucille Clifton. It's called Quilting. Somewhere in the unknown world, a yellow-eyed woman sits with her daughter quilting. Some otherwhere, alchemists mumble over pots. Their chemistry stirs into science. Their science freezes into stone. In the unknown world, the woman threading together her need and her needle nods toward the smiling girl. Remember, this will keep us warm. How does this poem end? Do the daughters quilt? Do the alchemists practice their tables? Do the worlds continue spinning away from each other forever? The first story that I'll read from tonight is Awo's story. Awo is Somali, and I'll just be reading excerpts of the story. But I've always believed that good writing is not about delivering information necessarily. It is about opening up human experiences and inviting others in. So this is from Awo's story titled The Strongest Love Story. The family's journey from Somalia is a story Awo knows only in bits and pieces. Memories play in her mind like scenes from a silent movie, with a simultaneous timeline that moves toward her mother's past and her own future, both shrouded in mystery. It was hot in Nairobi, Kenya. The family had been in the country for several years. Miriam was only in her early 30s and pregnant when she'd arrived with her 3 oldest children. Her youngest wasn't even conceived yet. The children saw the city only from their rooftop apartment. Awo has no memories of making her way through the busy streets below. Her maternal grandmother hung laundry to dry on the clothesline strung across the rooftop. The colorful hijabs and the white cotton makawis flapped in the wind like sails. Awo and her younger brother Mohammed played a game between the hanging sheets. Beneath the hot sun, the damp sheets were cool. The children laughed as they chased each other up and down the lines of clothes, caught up in the magic of their world, sandwiched between the expanse of the sky and the cement. Awo was chasing Mohammed. He ran between the sheets from one end of the rooftop to the other. He was leaping like a gazelle. Awo chased as fast as she could. He grabbed onto a metal rod at the edge of the cement wall that kept the children safe from a long fall. A sheet blew into Awo's face. She shoved it aside with both hands in time to see the metal rod turn and her 8-year-old brother swing off the roof. He held fast, his legs kicking at the air below. Neither of them made a sound. Then Awo heard the sound of the rod breaking. Mohammed flew before her eyes. She jumped after him, her hands cutting through air toward the boy who had become a blur of legs. She caught his ankle, one ankle in both hands. The young girl braced a bare foot against the cement wall and pulled. Awo swayed with the weight of her brother and felt her arms grow taut as she held tight with all the strength of her 10-year-old body and prayed to Allah. Mohammed's chin connected with the hard side of the building as Awo pulled him back onto the roof. Blood and tears soaked his face. Once she had wrestled him over the edge, she pulled him close to her neck, both of them too stunned to make a sound. Awo thanked Allah for her name that day. Awo means lucky in the Somali language. The 2 siblings stood on that roof shaking with their luck. Below them, on the street, the people were poor. Kenya was a kind country that had opened its doors to many of its African neighbors whose countries were ravaged by war and death. Its city streets were teeming with impoverished people in despair. Awo and Mohammed were not poor children. They were the children of professionals. They, the 3 oldest, had a special tutor who visited their apartment each weekday to help prepare them with English lessons for their lives across the ocean. Beyond their education, they were all well fed, unlike many of the children who wandered the streets. Each night, they slept in the safety of their apartment, cognizant of other children on the streets below. They did not know that some of those children found sleep each night only when they had placed heavy stones or bricks across their thin, shriveled bellies to quiet the cries for food in the darkened alleys of the city. Awo and Mohammed knew they were the fortunate ones, even in light of the near-death experience Mohammed had just survived. Awo dried Mohammed's tears with gentle fingers. They held each other as they made their way into the apartment, his head resting awkwardly on her thin shoulders. The boy was nearly as tall as his sister, despite a difference in age of 2 years. The pair took careful steps across the hot rooftop, now caught in roles they not quite envisioned. He clutched his middle tight. Awo felt like her mother. She had saved a life. While Awo's mother hardly ever talked of the past, she carried herself as someone in the business of saving lives. She split her time taking care of the youngest girls, the little girls she'd given birth to in Kenya, and then the new arrival, conceived during one of the rare visits from Awo's father, and thinking of a plan for the future. She was concerned because the new babies were not included in the original paperwork when the family had first entered Kenya and registered as refugees of war. When the applications were approved, Awo's mother faced a devastating decision: to come to America with her 3 oldest and leave her 2 youngest behind, or to stay in Kenya and try to obtain paperwork for the 2 new ones, knowing their presence would be challenging to explain in the context of a war and a husband who was not supposed to be traveling across borders for visits with his family. In the end, Awo's mother decided that her oldest children deserved a life beyond the rooftop apartment in Kenya. She phoned Awo's father and told him that the family would be separated. She and the 3 oldest would leave for America. Ayan would live with him and his parents, and little Soredo would be sent to Miriam's home village to be cared for by her beloved stepmother. She quieted his protest, reminding him that it was her stepmother who had taken care of her as a child and was fully equipped to do the same to her own child. She reminded him of a simple fact that they both believed deeply in: life is too valuable to face with fear. On the day the family was scheduled to leave for America, Awo's mother, with her hair done, her makeup on, her clothes flowing around her slender body, cuddled the baby to her breast. Their flight was scheduled for the evening. The woman spent all day from sunup until sundown crooning to the baby girl in her arms. Soredo, eat, my little one. Eat as much breast milk as you can. You will need it in the days ahead. Just before the family had to leave for the airport, their grandmother quietly approached Awo's mother and took the sleeping child from her arms. Awo's mother went to Ayan, the taller girl, and held her for a moment, touched her cheek tenderly, before carrying her down the steps of the apartment building. In the street, a car waited to take them back to Somalia. Awo and her brothers watched from the rooftop as their mother helped their grandmother and her youngest girl settle into the car. She did not cry. She simply waved. I'm going to skip ahead. So Awo's mother and Awo, they settled here in Minnesota, and her father and the little girls are back in Somalia. Every Saturday, the family gathers around their mother's phone. They use the phone cards to call home. First, they call Buhudal, then they call Laskanud. Every Saturday, in those conversations, they become a full family: a mother, a father, and their children, voices celebrating their gratitude for each other's safety and small successes. Each is reminded of the immense love in their lives, a love that survives unimaginable distance. That's from Awo's story. And then I'm going to skip ahead and read to you from Afghani's story. Afghani is from Afghanistan. During the day, he's an office worker, and at night, he's a Lyft driver in these cities. And this is a part of his story. So at 19, he graduates from university, and he is brilliant. So USAID go and they ask him to work for them, and he agrees. I returned to Kandahar with the initial protection of USAID. After a year, I was able to call my mother and my father and my younger siblings home, despite the bombs that continued to fall and the suicide bombings that we were reading about in the newspapers. It was not long after their return to our family home that the conditions in Afghanistan forced me out. At first, I received letters from the Taliban. The notes were threatening. We know who you are and what you are doing for the Americans, and if you don't stop, bad things will happen. When the notes did not get a response from me, I started receiving phone calls. They came throughout the day, early in the morning, late in the afternoon, during family meals in the evening. I could be standing at the local grocery waiting to pay. My phone would ring. I would pick up a man, each time a different man, but always it was a man's voice, would say to me in Pashto or Dari, "You're wearing a black shalwar right now. You're standing at your grocer's waiting to pay. If you don't stop your activities with the Americans, I will hurt you or your parents, or maybe your sisters, or that little brother of yours." Sometimes I just listened, and other times I tried to deny the charges. I'd lie and say, "No, no, no, you're mistaking me for someone else. I'm just the son of a small merchant." One or two laughed. The others got angry and talked to me of their witnesses and the documents they had showing my daily schedule, the people I went to see, the places I visited. Each day I grew more afraid, more distrustful of those around me, until the time came when I believed that staying in Kandahar would kill me and my family. I went first to my supervisor at USAID, an American woman with whom I had a lot of respect. She listened to my story with her head down, her hands in front of her, clasped on her desk. It was a familiar story to her. She worked with enough Afghans who had been threatened by the Taliban and knew of the disappearances and the deaths. She told me about the special immigrant visa that SIV offered through the State Department and told me to apply. She said that as a bookkeeper for USAID, I would qualify. However, the government only issued up to 50 such visas each year for both Iraqis and Afghans who had worked with the US Armed Forces or under Chief of Mission Authority. She spoke with some reservation because there was a 3-year wait period for security screening and clearance. Neither of us spoke the question in the room. Could I wait for 3 years? At home, my mother and father and I decided that the only way I could survive was if I hid in the house and stopped going out. I sent a message to my workplace to tell them I would not be coming in anymore. I sat deep in the bowels of our house, surrounded by the mud walls of my ancestors, knowing that if the Taliban wanted to find me, they could simply march through our front door and unleash their bullets. If they wanted, they could drop a bomb on all of us. I couldn't sleep or eat, despite the people I loved gathered around me, despite my mother and father assuring me of their love for me. They told me that hiding in our house was not an act of cowardice, but the actions of a reasonable human being. I felt young under their protection, and yet I was too old and had seen too much to believe that their love could protect me. Every minute that I was home that month, I felt keenly that everyone I loved was in danger because of my living presence. I made the decision to leave Afghanistan. I made arrangements with a human trafficker and was able to pay the price he demanded for taking me out of the country, $25,000 US. I tried to find a reputable trafficker, one who brought a contract for us to sign. The first line of the contract was a waiver. The trafficker was not responsible for my life or death. They had no responsibility to return my body, alive or dead. Everything that happened to me on the road to probable survival depended on my following all of their instructions. Even then, they could not guarantee that I would make it out of Afghanistan. Other clauses in the contract said things like they would divulge information only when it was necessary, and the less I knew, the safer I would be. I signed the contract with a black pen. My mother and my father hovered behind me. The trafficker averted his gaze sympathetically. And now I'll skip ahead. So Afghani ends up at a 5-star resort in Sweden, a 5-star resort that's been converted into a refugee camp. And there he's taken to the camp psychiatrist. The camp psychologist. The camp psychologist got to know me well. At first, she was unsure about my mental health. She was baffled by my request for a certificate of my humanity. She asked me if I believed I was human. I said, of course, but other people weren't so sure. So I needed help proving my humanity. She then offered to provide me with such proof. But why? I asked her. What is the difference between you and me? How come you are more human than me, in a position to observe and certify my humanity? After all, do we not have the same blood, the same makeup, the same dreams even? Why are you more successful in your humanity than I am in mine? I told her that if she was going to give me a certificate of my humanity, she would have to show me hers first. I had to know who had given her the authority to determine human certification. That is from Afghani's story. I'm going to now skip all the way to the back to Tommy Sar's story. Tommy Sar is a Cambodian American, again, in these cities. I'll just jump into the piece. Once my father and I had gone on a drive together after school. It was a splendid autumn day in Minnesota, perfect hoodie weather. The sun was high and the sky was blue and the clouds were white and scattered in the direction of the wind. My father picked me up from school. My teacher had gotten me ready, helping to secure my backpack to my wheelchair. When she saw my father walking our way, she said, "Mr. Sar, you have a smart one here. Tommy is a witty kid." The lines around my father's eyes fanned out with a smile. He said, "Yes, he is a smart kid." After school, my father drove us in our old white and brown Buick, bought used but new to us, through the nice neighborhoods in Minneapolis. I watched the back of my father's head in the big houses on either side of the street from my place behind him. All the houses looked empty, but their lights were on, so we knew that they were not empty, just way bigger than the people inside could fill. The trunks of the trees lining the streets were brown, a nice contrast against the grass still green from summer. The leaves were falling off the ash trees, raining yellow color like in a Korean drama. My father and I could have starred in a Korean drama about a loving father and his chill, wheelchair-bound son that day. I told my father that fall is my favorite season in Minnesota. I told him that I loved the smell of the dry leaves in the air. I asked him about his favorite time of the year when he was a boy like me. My father told me that when he was a boy in Cambodia, he loved the ending of the monsoons and the beginning of the dry seasons. He said the grass and the trees were at their luscious then. The earth gave off its own smell, not at all like dry leaves, but a smell like the dirt itself was blooming. I asked my father if he ever thought he'd leave Cambodia when he was a boy. He asked me if I thought I'd ever leave Minnesota. We both shook our heads, no. When we got to our house in Minneapolis, we both let out a sigh. It'd been a nice drive. Home was where we needed to be, but neither of us really wanted to go in. Except there was no time to linger because our front door opened and we saw one of my father's best friends waving. My father carried me inside. His friend greeted us by opening the screen door and then leading the way into the living room. My father set me up in front of the television. He went to the kitchen and grabbed beers for his friend and himself. His friend, a short guy who dressed like a teacher from the past, in a button-up shirt and slacks, asked, "Hey, Tommy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" I looked at my father and I answered, "A naval engineer like my father was in Cambodia." The friend clapped me on the shoulder. "Good boy." My father said, "Tommy is really smart at school. He can be anything he wants, a lawyer, a judge, anything at all." Just for fun, I asked, "What if I want to be an astronaut one day?" My father laughed out loud. "Then you will be an astronaut one day." We both knew there were no astronauts in wheelchairs, but I liked what he said. I liked that he said I could be one. He always tried to support everything positive I had to say about myself or the world that we lived in. Tommy is taken on his first vacation, and this vacation becomes an exile. He was taken with his aunt and his uncle, and one day he wakes up in the California house, and the aunt and the uncle are gone. And 2 weeks after that, he sees a moving van come to the door of the California aunt and uncle, and I'm going to begin from there, near the very end of the selection. Within 2 weeks, a moving van came to the house. On that day, California uncle had not gone to work. I watched as he opened the door for the men carrying my things. My bed, my other wheelchair, the possessions I had left behind in my room in Minnesota. I stopped being a chill kid that day. I stopped thinking California aunt and California uncle like a guest for their kindness. I became a refugee sent far from home. Later that night, I had California aunt call my father for me. Our conversation was short. My father said, "How are you, son?" I said, "I miss you." He sobbed, "I miss you too." I wanted to lash out at him, but I could not. I had been in this situation before. When I was a kid, my father used to take me to specialists all over the Twin Cities to try to treat my dystrophy. At one place, they gave me electric shock therapy. I remember lying in the bed with electrodes and crying with every shock the doctors administered. One time, I heard my brother Sam outside the room talking with our father. Sam asked him, "Why is Tommy crying? What's wrong?" Our father answered in a sobbing voice, "It's to help him. It is not bad. It is to help him." I remember that after I heard the cry in my father's voice, I quieted my own. I said, "I'll see you soon." He sobbed once again, "I miss you." I heard everything I needed in those words: his love, always his love, his optimistic love, a belief that one day we would be reunited. Perhaps when that day came, I could be the astronaut of our dreams and not just the disabled son of a Cambodian refugee struggling to make a normal life for himself and his family in Minnesota. I accepted that we couldn't help what we were, him and me, and that neither of us was ever going to go home again, that we would never return to our favorite seasons. These 3 stories are just 3 of the 14 from Somewhere into the Unknown World. At this point, I want to transition into the Q&A so that we can be in conversation. I'll let your questions dictate the trajectory of our time together. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Please, Sadiq, you can come back on and help me out.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, awesome. So we have a question. First question. Let me start my camera. So the first question I have is from Eden Bart. She said, uh, I don't want to butcher the Hmong greeting. I'm sorry if I butchered. Kalia, I'm a big fan of your writing. Can you share a bit about your process for this book, which is so different from your other books? How did you get the idea? How did you identify the individual? Did you have a series of interviews? Did they review your written words and provide feedback, etc.? I'm only about a third of the way throughout, and I look forward to reading each piece.
Thank you, Eden, for your wonderful question. This book is different from my other books, but I think it shows my evolution as a writer. You know, my very first book, The Late Homecomer, a Hmong family memoir, had in its title Family Memoir. For those of you who know the genre, you know that memoir in this country has traditionally been in the realm of like rather rich and famous people. People want to read the memoirs of the rich and the famous. So from the very first, my journey was in opposition to that. I was going to make room for the memoir for this family whose stories had never been documented in this way, my own family story. You know, that was in 2008. I was 27 years old when that book came out. After that, I followed it with the song poet. Again, this time the memoir of a song poet in a tiny language, the Hmong language. An incredible song poet who makes his life in America, now with the poetry in his heart, but with his hands in a factory. After that book, I thought long and hard. That book came out in 2016. 2016, I could see the winds of the nation changing. Donald Trump had just won the election, and I knew that there would be few, if any, refugees coming into the country. There was already across the nation this wind of nativism blowing. You know, as a child who loved books growing up, I would read books sometimes about these writers who are writing courageously in opposition to the powers that govern their countries. And I always thought, how did they do it? But there I was, 2016. I had just given birth to identical twin boys. I just coded in the process. So I died and they revived me and I was alive again. And there I was, living here in America, understanding and wanting everybody, not just refugees, but everybody to understand that what is beautiful about America is our understanding that we belong only because we belong to each other. You know, as we heard from the land acknowledgement, unless you're a native, all of us came from somewhere to call this place home. And it wasn't so many generations ago that we spoke with accents not so differently than my mother and my father's. And so there I was, and I had just died and come back to life. And I thought, why not do this the only way I know how? You know, my grandmother, who had been a shaman and a medicine woman, a healer, she'd always said to me, Mainai, if you want to build a life worth living, build it because of your faith, not your fears. And so I sought out to write a book in opposition to the government in charge of this country, a book centered on refugee lives. I knew that it was going to extend beyond the Hmong community because as a writer, I want to grow. As a human being, I know that my life extends across different communities. And so I wrote one story first, Sisters on the Other Side of the River. It was a story that an elderly uncle asked me to write. He said that he was getting old. He said that most of the people understood him to be a good man. He said that he's lived most of his life trying to be a good man, but that you don't leave a war innocent. And I said, why? And he said, because on the night of the crossing of the Mekong River, when he was leaving with his wife and his children, there were two sisters that approached him at the edge of that river. The older one was carrying a younger one, probably 3 or 4, but too weak to walk. She had a pot of rice in front of her, and she asked my uncle if he would take her sister across. She would give him everything she owned, that pot of rice, if he would carry the little girl on her back across. Their mom and dad had died in the jungles. She herself would wait along the banks of the river, but if he would please do this. He said that there was no room on the raft. He knew when he told her, he believed himself when he said, I will return for you and your sister. But he never made that return. That on the day where he escaped war, he condemned 2 sisters to a life, perhaps on the other side of the river. He said that as an old man, he knew that they were coming closer and that he was returning to the edge of that river and soon they would meet. He wanted the world to know the truth. And so I wrote that one story and I gave it to my editor, Riva Hockerman at Metropolitan Books. And I said, what do you think? And Riva said, Kalia, this is incredible. Continue writing, keep writing. And so I decided I would. I decided that I would talk to about 14 people because I knew that if I talked to more than that, it would continue forever. It would be a project without end. I knew enough about my own experiences as a member of a vulnerable community that there have been so many times when scholars and activists or writers have entered our community, they've asked us for our stories, and then they have a change of direction or they find a better case study and they never chose to make anything of it. I didn't want that to happen. I made a promise to myself that if somebody told me their story, I would write it down. And so that's exactly what I did. I sought out to find 14 stories, and I didn't look hard. I wanted to find them in the pieces around me already, the pieces that were already here in these cities. And that's exactly what Somewhere in the Unknown World is. But of course, we traverse wars from the last 50 years, refugees from around the world. And it's become this thing that I couldn't have envisioned in the very beginnings. Yes, it is a testament to the human resilience, but it is also a test of how welcoming we can be to each other, not only here, but around the world. And so that's just a little bit of my process for the book. It came out in 2020, right after the election of Joe Biden. And so in many ways, it was those 4 tumultuous years where I was doing most of the work for this book.
Eden says, thank you for that, Kalia. I appreciate it. Thank you on behalf of everybody sharing that and bringing these valuable stories to light. Shua says, that I love the song poet, beautiful memoir, resonates with me. We have a comment from Nicole. She said, thank you for giving these stories such a beautiful voice, especially since the majority of them do not usually get told. How do you take care of yourself while listening, learning, and then retelling these stories as they are so heartfelt and must tug at so many emotion and memories?
Oh, that's such an important question. So I have to say, I have three little kids. I have a daughter who's 7 and identical twin boys who are 5. And perhaps this is kind of a strange response, but I think that there's no age too young to start the act of caring. My children do a wonderful job of taking care of my heart. You know, today one of my boys, for example, dug in the yard because it rained, so the yard was soft, and he found a stone shaped like a triangle. And he came back and he says, "Mama, I found a fossil." I said, "Yeah, what is it?" He says, "Maybe it's a back plate of a stegosaurus, or maybe it is." He had 2 other names, and he held up he held up at different angles of his head and told me all these wonderful things. And watching him, I marvel. I marvel very much the way my mother must have when I was younger. When we first come to America, in the late 80s, we were the biggest wave of Hmong people to come to the country. When we came, there were people who understand that Hmong people were coming, but they didn't know why we were here. And living in the housing projects of St. Paul, I grew up in the McDonough housing project for a time. There would be people and they would throw bottles, not at us, but around us, in the places where we played, in the places where we gathered. And growing up, I used to pick up the shattered shards of glass. And I used to believe people, I genuinely did, that I had found diamonds in a world that dreamed of them. I remember coming to my mom with handfuls of glass and telling her I found diamonds. And I wanted to know what I should do with the diamonds. And my mother, instead of breaking my child's heart, said to me, "You should bury them for other children to find." You know? So even now, in that little, square of a yard, 1475 Timberlake Road, apartment C, there's diamonds buried for other children to find. In these ways, my life is full of magic, full of possibility. I try to live quietly and I try to live humbly. Every day, I try to do something to make the world a better place. And if I don't do so well, then I wake up the next day and I tell my heart, the sun is shining for a reason. I get another try. But really, Shua, the heart of your answer is perhaps the heart of my answer to your question is really perhaps this truth. In 1987, my family was transported as refugees of America's secret war in Laos. If you had told any one of us on that plane, the hundreds and hundreds of us, that one day one of the little girls right on that plane would become a writer and that she would build a life because of our stories, none of us would have believed, including me. What was a writer? What did a writer do? Who would care about our stories? Where would they find their home in a bigger world? In many ways, my life is an example of how the impossible happens every single day in the life of a refugee. When I think about my trajectory, the magnitude of the things I've done and the things my heart yearns to do, I cannot give in to despair. I cannot give in to anger or sadness. There is so much hope, so much beauty. And so, in a beautiful, if imperfect world, I would try, knowing that trying is enough. I think about it this way. We live in the same world that created the great people in our history books. Martin Luther King Jr., he had a dream. We all know that dream is far from realized, but he dreamed such a big dream that here I am all these many years later, working on behalf of that dream, sharing in its vision still. That gives me hope. So it's all good. We live in the same world that have created the great ones. We're great not because we succeed, but because we try. Try to do something bigger than ourselves. I hope I spoke to some of your questions. Sadiq, do we have others?
Thank you again, Kalia. Such a wonderful, poignant. Uh, the question I have comes from the next question is from Renee. What was the most joyous memory you have in writing this book, in gathering these stories?
And I'm gonna do something funny. I'm gonna close the window because my neighbor has decided to cut a tree in the life of the pandemic. I will be right back to answer
Okay, no problem. You know what, everybody, it's a life. Like Renee says, thank you for your patience and thank you for Kalia doing this program at the evening. So this is actually perfect time to cut grass,
a
or
tree.
in your case, tree, your neighbor's case. So no worries. No, you don't need to apologize.
Oh, well, thank you, you all. I closed the window, so we'll see if things get a little bit better. You know, so the question, remind me again,
Yep.
Sadiq, what the question was.
The question is from Renee. What was the most joyous memory you have in writing this book, in gathering these stories?
So the lock on this door doesn't work, people. It's my office. It's my writing office. The lock didn't work when we moved in, and then the kids realized this. And although I needed the quiet, I couldn't lock the door. I didn't have it in me to like repair the door so that should they try to get in, it would lock them out. So the most joyous memories for me are halfway in between in some of these pieces when I'm crying my heart out. The door slams open and they say, "Boo, mommy, did we scare you?" You know, those were incredible memories. You know, the boys are now 5 and my daughter is 7, but throughout the whole process of writing this book, they were much younger. There were some moments when I was writing away, and my little boys, you know, they learned to crawl. They would nip at my feet like little dogs. And I remember stopping and just marveling every space along every, you know, as I was writing each piece, to see how much they were growing, to see the beauty of who they were. I couldn't help believing. So I was optimistic through every single story. Mr. Michael, an Eritrean refugee whose story is in here and officially unconfirmed, because that is a truth that governs so many refugee lives. Mr. Michael told me that peace is possible if we hold on not only to the sad stories, but the good ones. I knew, even as I was writing through some tears, that the stories I had in this collection were great ones. You know, what I offered wasn't going to be a mirror reflection for each of these individuals. I was going to make a portrait of them, of the stories that they've shared. And that gift, the understanding that what I was making, what I was trying to do was creating a gift that was enough to sustain me. That and all of the toddling that was happening around me. Uh, Lots of joy, actually, in the process of writing this book, despite the fact that it felt at times like the world was caving in from the outside. There was so much beauty inside, and I knew that we could open the doors and the windows, just wait out the seasons, and everything would be okay. That gave my heart confidence. Thank you. What a beautiful question.
Thank you. We have a follow up. Another comment from Shua. I'm sorry if I didn't say the name correctly, but thank you. It is the same hope our parents held on to when they arrived here, and the same hope we continue to strive for. Uh, Another comment from Brandy say, thank you, Kalia, for sharing your story and the stories of others near you. This is true gift to the world. And again, Renee say thank you. I wanted just to, because of the time, I wanted to see, if there's someone who wants to unmute himself and ask a question, but at the same time, respectfully, like Kalia has said it, she reserved the right to answer them. So if anyone wants to speak, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself, then ask your question. Thank you.
Please don't be shy, you all. No one?
Kalia, hello, this is Mary.
Hello, Mary.
Thank you so much for doing this program. It's so lovely to hear you speak about your writing as well. I was just wondering what your next project will be, or what you think you're going to work on next.
Oh, that is a lovely question, Mary. So on October 5th, I have a new children's book coming into the world. It's called From the Tops of the Trees. It is a story about a father's love, particularly in this case, my father's love for me. There are not a lot of books out there about Asian American fathers, not even to say Hmong American fathers. And in this book, I recall a memory of living in Bambi refugee camp, the place where I was born, how my father used to take me to the tops of the trees so that I might see a bigger world. He would tell me, Menai, you are not a child of poverty, war, or despair. My daughter is hope being born, the captain to a more beautiful future. And I've always believed him, you know. I am who I am today because long before I knew what was possible, I saw in his eyes his tremendous faith. You know, I'm big because I was always big in his eyes, if that makes sense. Although I'm very tiny in the real world that we live in, right? So that book is coming October 5th. I had a book, Yang Warriors, just come out last month. So I'm generating a lot in terms of books coming out. Right now, I have to finish 2 books. One of them is called The Diamond Explorer, and that one is fictional. It is about a young Hmong boy who's destined to become a great shaman, but all the great shamans in his life are dead. So how? And then a longer piece, and again, a long-awaited memoir titled Return of the Refugees, about my mother's story. I've written a book about my father's life, a book about my grandmother and the Hmong American experience. And I know that I want to write a book about my mother's, but I couldn't do it until I became a mother myself. I couldn't do it until I knew I could do it justice. You know, my mother who left her mother at the age of 16 to walk toward a life with my father and all of us. My mother, who for most of my life told me that one day, whenever she returned to her mother, she would tell her mother about all of the things that have happened. From the age she was 16, all of the funny moments and the silly ones and the sad ones, she would tell her mother everything. 3 years ago, my older sister and I took our mother back. We took her back to Laos, where her mother was buried. Her mother died. And I thought maybe when we visited Grandma's gravestone that my mom would have a lot to say. How little I knew. You know, my grandma's burial mound is in my uncle's backyard. And when we went in, you know, his prize bull was there making noise. There was a hen and her chicks. You know, ants were crawling all over the grave mound. But in the fashion of my mother's people, her mother's grave mound had a tiny little spirit door facing the east. When my mother put her hands to that door, the ants scurried away. The hen and her chicks left the yard. The prize bull retreated to his corner. The wind stopped blowing. My older sister and I thought that perhaps we should also leave. And so we walked out of the gate and we stood there waiting for our mother for her words to begin. But what we heard was a young girl, a 16-year-old girl crying for a mother whose love has sustained her for a whole lifetime apart. And so after that experience, I knew that I wanted to write my mom's story. My mother's eldest brother also said to her, Ju, if you have words to say to me, then say it now when I can hear you. Don't wait until I'm gone. She had nothing to say, so he said, do you know that when our father died, you were always the blanket that kept my heart warm? And I thought, how beautiful and how wise. If I want to write this book, and I do, then I want to write it when my mother's still here. When my mother can hear me read from its pages. When she can know for a fact that her story will live on, even when she's gone. And so I'm writing a book about this tiny Hmong woman who the chairs are too high for. So every time my mom sits, she swings her legs like a little girl. I'm writing this book about a Hmong girl who was born with a different name, but who a spirit took away at the age of 3. And so they had to rename her to hide her from the spirit, and they named her Ju bells, right? Bells, because bells ring, because bells alert you, because they sometimes warn you of the dangers, and sometimes they're just music to your ears. So I'm working on those 2 projects presently, and lots of other children's books, which will come out hopefully in the next 5 years. So almost every year, there'll be 2 new children's books coming from me, and then we continue on. But what's really exciting is that A Map into the World and the Most Beautiful Thing, both of these books will be translated into Hmong, Chinese, Spanish, and French in the fall for the St. Paul Public Schools and anybody else who's interested as well. So lots of exciting things happening.
Thank you for that answer, Mary. I echoed Mary's comment and say thank you so much for that beautiful answer. We have so much to look forward to from you. We have a comment from Crystal saying, Young Warriors is wonderful along with your other picture books. Thank you for writing for our young readers. And I did list out link to your site and Twitter and all the books that you have published. So if anyone is interested, they can go and find out, click it. So I wanted to, I know we are out of it, almost out of time. One question I want you to answer is that uh, as an author, as a mom, as an educator, as overall multiple hats you carry, and we are so thankful for you. What is one message you would like to leave with folks who join here or the folks who will be watching, especially as it relates to how to continue the message that you have echoed throughout your books, which is resilience, hope, overcoming, and surviving. What is the message you would like to share with folks, and that they can take it and maybe also share with kids in school or etc.?
That is such a good question. It's like you're offering me candy, Sadiq. My grandma was very wise and she left me with many wonderful words. When I was a kid, whenever she said anything, I would say, okay, grandma, okay. And she'd look at me and she'd say, surrounded by wisdom, without the experience to back it up, Kalia, you don't know how to use it. I mean, how true is that? She used to tell me, because she was a healer and a medicine woman, that every time I had the power to help somebody, I had the ability to hurt them. I didn't understand that until I became a teacher. When I became a teacher, I reflected on all of the great teachers of my life, and every single one of them has never set my limits, Sadiq. They have always only ever pushed for my greatest possibilities. I think about that in the work that I do. Every book that I write is a love letter to someone somewhere. Every time I speak, it's never with notes because I want to speak to you all. I want to talk to you across the screen, across the distance of space and time. I want to say that I'm here and you are here and we're here together. Whenever I do my work, I'm never looking for agreement or disagreement. It is a deeper understanding I'm in search of. Whether this is the work I do on the page or in a talk format like this, I don't care if you agree or disagree. That is no way to live. If we can understand a little bit deeper because we've met, then we've already succeeded. These are the markers of my journey. When all is said and done, I know that, well, let me put it this way. I belong to a people who believe in our ancestors. Every year we have a meal around New Year's time and we invite our ancestors to the table. When I was a little girl, in the smoke of the incense sticks, I used to be able to see them coming to our table, these ancestors, faceless but formed, taking sips of hot broth, eating spoonfuls of rice. Now I'm 40 years old. I've been on this writing journey since I was 22. I've been doing this since. Now I understand that ancestral table was never limited to the size of our kitchen, but extends far beyond these walls. One day I will take my place among the ancestors, Sadiq. And when I do, I want my descendants to know that everything I was doing was always for them. Just as all of my ancestors, all of us here now, we are our ancestors' dreams. We were always as far into the future as they were ever going to get, and they knew that. I want my descendants to know that they don't have to go into the world looking for the pieces of themselves. If these books live on, then there are pieces of me in there for them. A little bit of their history, even if it is not the history of a bigger world. A little bit of who they are is embedded in each thing that Kalia does. I go many places that Hmong people have never gone before, whether this is institutions, colleges, and universities. And every time I go, my heart gets a little bit afraid. And I have to tell myself, Kalia, if your heart gets a little bit braver, then the Hmong people get braver. Understanding each and every step of the way that the art I am doing, the literature I'm creating, is not limited to my people. It is for a bigger world. A long time ago, somebody asked me what it was like to be young and Hmong and female and to do the work I do. And afterward, I gave them an answer, but afterward, my dad said to me, did they ask you what it was like to be my daughter? And I said, kind of. And he said, Kalia, I want you to understand this, that the work you will do will go beyond your gender. It will go beyond your people. It is for a bigger humanity. That is the person I gave birth to. I want all of you out there to be reminded of the incredible gifts embedded in the human words that we share to each other. We live in a country where we throw so many words away all the time. But I come from a people that still believes that words have to write on memory. And so if we use our words understanding how heavy they are or how light they can be for another human heart, that is the gift that we have to give each other. Thank you for such a good final question, Sadiq.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, such a wonderful excerpt reading and sharing details and answering this question. We're so delighted to having you, and I know you are a locally based author, but you are a national treasure. I'm so delighted, like everybody else, having you join us tonight, and also continuously working, sharing your story, sharing other people's story, and also using the children books and other age appropriate books. So again, thank you. There's no words to describe it. So I just wanted to say thank you all, everybody who joined us tonight. And thank you, Kalia. And just quick question. I know we're out of time. What is the best way for folks to reach out to you or stay engaged? Can you share it? Where they can find you?
My website, if you want to see silly photos of my children or random thoughts, and Twitter is pretty good, but my website is where I'll have most of the news and the updates. And then I hope that to continue partnering with the Dakota Library and doing programs for all of you. I believe in the beauty of celebrating each and every single one of us every single day. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all, everybody. And one thing I want to say is that this topic, this book, when we were talking with Kalia, she mentions that I need to read the excerpt because of the time we are in, and she felt this is appropriate. And I just want to recognize that, and also recognize everybody that, as a community, as a society, when we all look out for each other, we will do better. And from one person to another, recognizing how humanity is important and only thing we can have left besides the story. So having said that, thank you again, everybody. I'll